So we're going to do something really dangerous. We're going to get inside my head. I'm going to allow you in the next 15 minutes to think like a granddad. Those two kids there, they're two of my grandchildren. They've got their back to us and they're walking away. They're not just walking away from their family home when they grow up. They're walking away from our society in New Zealand. Pardon me. There is 82,000 Kiwis a year are leaving New Zealand. I wonder why. I'd like to take you through my story and let you understand how I got to think the way I do. That's my granddad. I didn't know my granddad. In fact, I didn't know any of my grandparents. But I know that generation sacrificed for mine. They went without so that children born in the 50s and 60s had great opportunities. And I took mine. I've had some success, but I've found that success is a very poor teacher. I think there's more learning in those moments of self-doubt, failure, and even despair. For they teach you humility, they teach you compassion, and they teach you to understand the world you live in. That house was our family home. There were 7 kids, 9 people in total living there, and it certainly wasn't full of material things. But it was rich in ideas. Ideas that we debated every day. That's the legacy of my father. That child there is not me, but if it was, it would be a young child counting words instead of reading them, because that's who I was. I spent years at school with the education system thinking that I was average or even below average because of that. It wasn't until I got to high school that the education system said, hang on a minute, he's good at this, why isn't he good at that? And I had special remedial reading. I was privileged to have that. And this wasn't a flash-as school. This was the education system in 1972. That young man there on the motorbike, he was a rebellious young man and he didn't get on with his parents. He was very lucky that a local doctor took him in and said, I'll treat you as a son, and he did. And I certainly didn't deserve it. I betrayed his trust at every opportunity. But instead of letting on that I was betraying his trust, he just sat there quietly and talked to me, reassured me, gave me self-respect. That man selflessly invested in my future. His name was Dr. Budge. I call these the learning years, and boy, there's a lot of learning there. So the first one is I joined broadcasting. That was my state-funded education in electronics. I didn't pay for it. It was given to me. It served me well. But being the entrepreneurial type that I am, I gave up a secure job and I went and stood in an empty factory and said, with this small idea that I've got, I'm going to build a business. It was a modest business. It was too modest. I couldn't make ends meet and I couldn't pay the salaries. So I went and got another job at the local oil refinery. And I managed, between the two of them, working 70 to 80 hours a week to keep the doors open. But you can imagine how long you can work 70 to 80 hours a week. So a few years later, I decided to take voluntary redundancy and I paid off the bank and I got rid of my business. So simultaneously, I shut down my business and I quit my job at the oil refinery. A friend of mine, so I had a lot of debt. I got rid of the bank, but I had a lot of creditors. And I was considering leaving New Zealand and going to Australia and just leaving my creditors behind. And a friend of mine at the oil refinery said, Selwyn, is that the sort of person you want to be? And those words resonated with me. They resonated because it sounded like Dr. Budge 20 years earlier. This was about responsibility, and I wanted to take it. I didn't know what was going to happen. My family had never been unemployed. They'd certainly never taken the unemployment benefit. So here was I lining up for the dole, the first person in my family to do so. But I was desperate. I had no credit, and I had massive debts. I couldn't put food on the table, and I certainly couldn't pay for petrol to get in the car to drive somewhere to apply for a job. So I was in a poverty trap. So you always think of poverty traps as somebody who may be lazy, somebody who may be talentless, but somebody else. But this was me. And I wasn't lazy, and I wasn't talentless. Despite that, despite my desire to work, it took me 6 months to find a job. The hardship that I went through, my family went through, gives me a real understanding of the social impact, of the real misery that sits behind our unemployment figures today. Eventually, I got a job as a sales manager. A few years later, I was the CEO of the company. And the companies that I was managing as CEO just got bigger and bigger. And before I knew it, I was part of the world's 1%. I had a very high income, I had assets, and I had influence. And I'd done it myself, all by myself. Like all 1%ers, I'd done it by myself, and my success was mine alone. So I thought. And then I had an epiphany, and it happened. I landed in India. I flew in the night before. I was suffering from jet lag. I got up in the morning and I thought, go for a walk. I walked across the lobby of this opulent hotel, and I opened the door and I walked outside, and I was instantly hit with all the usual things, the heat, the smell, the dust, but the poverty. I looked back at the hotel, the marble, the gold, the brass, and I looked back on the road, and here was this girl already standing in front of me with her hand out, looking for some coins. And in that second, I knew I didn't want to be part of the world's 1%. I knew that I wanted to be part of a society that was more equal. And I didn't want to live in a society that was this unequal. I realized in that moment that I'd been born into a life of privilege, that a whole lot of things had been put in place by a previous generation that I was able to leverage, that gave me a hand up. I didn't do it. My grandparents did it. I came back to New Zealand in 2001, but in that period after the Indian incident in 2001, I'd been looking at various societies and trying to understand how they were either more equal or less equal, and what were the things that were contributing to it. So I was on the lookout, but inequality stayed top of mind. I came back in 2001, and I started 2 companies, and they grew quickly. The cars in the car park increased, and then I noticed the quality of the cars increasing. I rocked up to work one day and I said, wow, there's so many people dependent on the success of these companies. And these companies are now paying more than twice the average salary. And the children of our employees have got a great start in life as a result. And I was proud of that. And I remember thinking, anyway, this world, this high-tech world, it's a great world. It's where ideas are the highest currency you can have. It's where the opportunities for the employees are endless. And this is the tradable economy. It's the economy that I love. I love it because it brings foreign wealth back into our economy. I love it, most of all, because it creates an integrated and mutually dependent society with an equitable distribution of wealth. That's the main point. I love it because it means my grandchildren may not join the 82,000 Kiwis that leave New Zealand each year, many of them looking for more enjoyable employment or employment at all. So this was my second epiphany. Kyla had said talk about what drives you. Well, what drives me now is that I think the quality of our society is dependent on employment. And I think meaningful employment should be our highest goal, a national goal, because it's the fastest way of solving the inequality gap. So this is where my life changed, and it went from personal and business to economic and politics. Because suddenly I realised that there was no way of actually changing the way New Zealand was as an individual businessman. I could have an influence, a little bit, but actually the issues that we were facing were economic, and they were economic beliefs. So I jumped on a plane, and I flew down to Wellington, and I talked to various ministers about the needs to change some of the laws in our land. Simple laws, for me, not that great. But I quickly found out that we weren't in a position to change those laws, that there were people stacked up on the other side that would fight hard and were well-resourced. And this hard bit for me to swallow is a lot of that was us, that we, the voters, were the problem. So there's two economies in my mind. There's the tradable and speculative economy. And the speculative economy, I'll use housing as the example. If I gave you all $10 million today, where would you invest it? Most of us would do property. In fact, I did the calculations the other day. If I sold up all my businesses and I'd put all my money into housing investment in Auckland last year and leveraged the bank's money, I would have made $15 million. So why didn't I do it? Why didn't I invest in property? Because the social outcomes are so high. In the tradable economy, we create more exports, more jobs, less foreign debt, lower interest rates, an equitable wealth distribution, and a cohesive society. In the speculative economy, we have exactly the opposite. Essentially, you invest in the tradable economy and you're investing in shared wealth and more jobs. You invest in the speculative economy and you're investing in your wealth and less jobs. So these problems are real and they're global. It's not just New Zealand. And countries that don't look at the need to change those macroeconomic settings at the top, they're in trouble because the speculative economy will keep growing at the expense of employment and therefore the quality of our society. But hey, what do I know? I'm not an economist. So does anyone know what that is? Well, that is a device that was presented to the London School of Economics in 1949. It predicts the outcome of monetary and fiscal policy on the economy. It's a whole lot of water and valves, and it's not that hard to understand. Here's New Zealand's version of it. This was used right up into the 1970s. So how hard is economics, if that's what it is? Why do we allow people to tell us what is intuitively wrong? That we can make money out of speculation over here, and people who do really hard stuff and create jobs for our kids are not supported. How does that happen? This is my economics. I ran an oil refinery. You want to learn about second and third order problems? Try doing that. This is an exothermic reaction. You get it wrong, and there's serious consequences. So those are big valves, big flows, and I controlled it. As we said in the introduction, I went around the world and I talked to a number of economists. And I was staggered to find not only that my views held water, but actually their long-term fears were about inequality. Their long-term fears were exactly the same as mine. And I think Joseph Stiglitz nailed it. And he basically said, well, you can see what he said up there, inequality is an inefficient distribution of capital. And if it's inefficient, it's bad for you and me. It's bad for everyone. Gareth Morgan's picked up on the same subject. And he said our overindulgence in housing in New Zealand is diverting capital away from what it should be used for, creating businesses and employment. So those are my 2 grandchildren. They still don't know what's going on. They still don't know the decisions we're making, but they have some belief in their granddad. They have some belief that their granddad might be out there changing your mind about what you might invest in. They're running back towards us. They're positive. And that's what we can do for those kids, your grandkids, if we all start thinking like a granddad. Thank you.